Hello, me again. Today we'll continue talking about the nutrition process in human, and we'll move on to talk about the absorption of food. It's gonna be easy, okay? And have your notes, pen, highlighters ready, and then in 10 minutes you will understand the basic processes involved in the absorption of food. All right, let's go. Now, last time we actually completed talking about the digestion of food, and you should remember that most of the carbohydrates in our ingested food are broken down into monosaccharides, right? While most of the proteins are broken down into amino acids, and most of the lipids or fats are broken down into fatty acids and glycerol. Okay, by means of chemical and physical digestion. And these end products, monosaccharides, amino acids, fatty acids, and glycerol, these four end products of digestion are ready for absorption by our body. And the main organ for absorption is the small intestine. Okay, now let's have a look at the structure of the small intestine and see why it is well adapted for absorption of digested food. Firstly, we have to understand that this main hollow canal in the small intestine is known as lumen. Okay, and then surrounding the lumen, you can see there are actually some finger-like projections, a lot of finger-like projection, and each one is known as a villus. Okay, and on the outer layer of the small intestine, you can find two layers of muscle which can contract and relax and bring about peristaltic movement to move the food along the small intestine. Alright, now so let's have a look at the adaptive feature of the small intestine and see how it is adapted for absorption of food. Firstly, I've mentioned this several times in our lessons that the small intestine, or to be more precise, the ileum of the small intestine, is actually the longest part of the digestive tract. Okay, and why is it so long? It's almost like 7 meters, and this long length can actually increase the time for absorption of food. So the time for absorption is longer. With the long length, the food can also pass along a large surface area so as to facilitate the absorption of digested food. Please help me to add this word, digested food, and water. Okay? Next is, have a look at this finger-like projection. There are so many of these finger-like projections. Okay? And these projections that is known as villus, or in plural form, we call this villi, okay, can greatly further increase the surface area for absorption of water and digested food. Alright, okay, most of the digested food is absorbed in the small intestine, and then this can lower the water potential in the blood and maintain a steep water potential gradient for water absorption. Now, if you want to know more about this, you can look it up by yourself, or you can ask me personally later in whatever means, okay? But now I'm not going to discuss it further because it won't appear in the examination, okay? Remember. Okay, now please turn to page 15. Now we'll have a closer look at the structure of the villus. Now firstly, for each this finger-like projection, each villus, you can see there is an outermost layer which is made up of a very thin layer of cell, alright? This thin layer of cell is known as epithelium. Alright? And then this whole layer is made up of individual cells, alright, known as epithelial cell. The epithelium is very thin, so the digested food can absorb very quickly through this epithelium, alright, as it provides a very short diffusion distance of digested food. Alright, apart from epithelium, look inside this villus. You can see there is a central tube. Alright, this central tube is known as the lacteal. Alright, it is a place for absorption of lipid or oil or fat. Alright, and then surrounding this lacteal, all these are actually blood capillaries. Alright, so the villus is actually rich in blood supply, and the reason for this is that the food can be readily absorbed into the blood and be carried away very quickly. Now, if we cut the villus like this and then look from the top, look from the above, and this is what you can see. Okay, on the outermost layer is the epithelial cell, making up the epithelium, which is only one cell thick and shorten the diffusion distance for absorption of food. And then at the central part, you can see the lacteal. Okay, and surrounding the lacteals, you can see these red circles. These red circles are actually the cross section of the large network of blood capillary. Okay, now we have to understand how food is absorbed into the villus. Firstly, for glucose or monosaccharides and amino acids, these two kind of food substances are water soluble. And for water soluble food substances, they can be absorbed into the blood capillary. Alright, into the blood capillary through two processes, namely diffusion and active transport. Now, at this moment, you don't need to understand what diffusion and active transport means exactly, but you just have a very brief understanding that there are actually two processes involved in the absorption of glucose and amino acids into the blood capillaries. Once the food enters the blood capillary by diffusion and active transport, the food will be carried away from the small intestine and then to the liver. Okay? Now, as for the absorption of fatty acids and glycerol, it is a little bit more complicated. I want you to listen very carefully. Glycerol and fatty acids will be absorbed into the epithelial cell. Alright? Firstly, they will be absorbed into the epithelial cell by means of diffusion. Okay? And then afterwards, within the epithelial cell, the fatty acids and glycerol will recombine into fat molecule. So this red thing is actually the fat molecule. After recombination of fatty acids and glycerol into fat molecule, this fat molecule will then diffuse into the lacteal. Okay, and the lacteal will transport away this lipid. We will move on to the wordings, how we're going to describe the absorption of digested food. Firstly, as you can see, this villus can provide a very large surface area. For the absorption of digested food. Next is, I've already mentioned, the epithelium is very thin. It is only one cell thick, or you can just write thin epithelium, so that the food can be absorbed through a very short distance, a short diffusion distance. So shorten the distance of diffusion for the absorption of digested food. Next is, you can see there are a lot of blood capillaries, right? So that the glucose or monosaccharides and amino acids and minerals and all the other water-soluble food substances, such as water-soluble vitamins. In grade 9, you should know that vitamin C is actually water-soluble. They can be absorbed into the blood by means of diffusion and active transport. Now I have to repeat that you do not need to understand what does it mean by diffusion and active transport at the time being, but you will understand this later in senior forms. You just need to know that there are actually two processes involved in the absorption of these food substances into the blood, okay? And then water can also be absorbed by means of another process which is called osmosis into the blood. Okay, as there are lots of blood capillaries, so that the food can be absorbed and transported away very quickly, and then this can maintain something called steep concentration gradient, which can increase the rate, or we can say to facilitate the absorption of food. Now, what does it mean by steep concentration gradient? We'll talk about this in more details in senior forms. So for the time being, just memorize this is okay. You don't need to understand that into more detail, or you can find it out yourself on the internet. Okay. Now, the last part is the presence of lacteal. I've told you it is for absorption of lipid and fat-soluble vitamins such as vitamin A and vitamin D. Okay, and then the lipid and the fat-soluble vitamin absorbed into the lacteal will be transported in the lacteal and eventually into the lymphatic system. Okay, because the lipid is transported very quickly, so that a steep concentration gradient is maintained. Okay, again, you do not need to understand what does it mean for the time being. Okay, now that's it for the absorption of digested food. Okay, once again, I'm telling you that water-soluble digested food will be absorbed into the blood. Okay, while lipid after digestion is broken down into fatty acids and glycerol, right? And these two will recombine inside the epithelial cell into lipid molecule, and then the lipid will get into the lacteal and transported away and eventually into the lymphatic system. Okay, the lymphatic system. Alright, that's almost the end of absorption of food. Now have a look at page 16. Here you can see two photomicrographs showing a real alimentary canal of human beings. Okay, and then when answering questions regarding absorption of food, remember, write only the features that you can observe from the photomicrograph. For example, this diagram on the left, you can see here are some finger-like projection, right? So if the question asks you, what is the adaptation of the alimentary canal according to this diagram, you can write that there are finger-like projection. To increase the surface area for absorption of digested food. Okay. On the other hand, for this diagram, okay, you can see there are lots of black lines here. all these black lines are actually blood capillaries. So when you see this diagram, please write, you can see dense network of blood capillary. Okay, please do not mix this up. Okay, for example, if you are given the left diagram, you cannot write dense network of blood capillaries because you cannot see. Okay, now that's something that you have to bear in mind when you are tackling the examination. All right, now please turn to page 17. Okay, I've already told you that there are actually two layers of muscles found on the outer layer of the small intestine. Okay, here you can see muscle layer A and muscle layer B. I want you to write down the names of these two muscle layers. Okay, the first, which is closer to the villus, is the circular muscle. Okay, muscle layer B is the longitudinal muscle. Can you recognize this part? It is finger-like, right? So this is the villus. Yo, that's the end of absorption of food in human body. Now, please don't forget to complete the online quiz and send to me by the end of this week. And if you have any questions, please, you're welcome to join the live Q&A session to be held this Saturday at 5 p.m. Using Zoom. And the link to Zoom will be sent to you 5 minutes before a meeting to your e-class mail. And alright, now enjoy the rest of the day. Goodbye.